Hi, folks. We're going to look at chapter 11 today. And today's chapter has a very interesting title. It's The Emotional Life of Christ. In fact, the author kind of starts out by talking about the difficulty that you and I have in, grasping that title, but just grasping the humanity of Jesus. Now, we understand that Jesus was human when he was here, when he was born of a virgin. We understand his humanity up until the point that he left to go be with the Father. But you and I have a hard time grasping his humanity right now as he's with the Father. And so he's going to kind of focus on the whole implication of his humanity. In fact, he talks about that over on page 104. One implication of this truth of Christ's permanent humanity is that when we see the feeling and passions and affections of the incarnate Christ towards sinners and sufferers as given to us in the four Gospels, we are seeing who Jesus is for us today. The Son has not retreated back to a disembodied divine state in which he existed before he took on flesh. What's he saying here? He's wanting you and I to grasp that right now, Jesus, sitting on the right hand of the Father, interceding for us, advocating for us, is the same Jesus who expressed his humanity when he was among us. And part of the expression of that humanity is emotions, because emotions are a part of what it means to be human. Emotions are not sinful. You and I need to understand that we were created to be emotional beings. Therefore, Jesus is emotional. But the reality with Jesus is that he has perfect emotions. So then what the author does, and he does it by looking at that great theologian from Princeton back in the early 20th century, B.B. Warfield, he is focusing on the reality of two emotions that Jesus expressed, one being compassion, we understand that, and the other being anger. And it's a really good discussion that we're going to see here. Now, before we get into the whole issue of his anger and compassion, let me just stop for a moment and remind you what he's doing. So we're up to chapter 11 now. And with each chapter, the author has been taking us deeper into understanding Christ's heart for you and I, his children. He has, as he's been doing that, helping you and I to correct our thinking about some things. And that's especially going to be true today when we look at this whole issue of the emotions that Jesus has as far as his anger and his compassion. He's going to correct our thinking about some things. So he's going to explore the whole aspect of the reality of Jesus being compassionate and his anger. So let's talk about his compassion. If you go with me over on page 106, he's talking about the reality of Jesus here. Look at what it says. Jesus did not simply operate in deeds of compassion, but actually felt the inner turmoils and rolling emotions of pity towards the unfortunate. When the blind and the lame and the afflicted appealed to Jesus, his heart responded with a profound feeling of pity for them. His compassion fulfilled itself in outward acts. But what is emphasized by the term employed to express our Lord's response is the profound internal movement of his emotional nature. Hearing the plea, for example, of the two blind men for sight, or that leper for cleansing, or simply hearing any plea, seeing a distressed widow, set our Lord's heart throbbing with pity. In each of these instances, Jesus is described as acting out of the same internal state. What internal state? He is described as acting out of his emotion of compassion. So we see that. Now, you and I don't have a hard time recognizing the compassion of Jesus. That's not where we struggle. We're going to talk about where we struggle here in a moment, but I just want to remind you so that when we talk about the compassion of Jesus, you and I might need to be reminded of that right now, because we could say, yeah, I see that in the Gospels, George, but where we have a hard time struggling with is Jesus compassionate towards us right now? And he is, because he's fully human and he acts out of his compassion. Now, where we struggle with is the second emotion that the author is focusing on here, especially as he looks at the works of B.B. Warfield, and that is the reality of his anger. And where we struggle is how does anger fit with what he's presenting us in Gentle and Lowly? In fact, those who struggle with the whole reality of this book, and there are some who struggle with the reality of this book, thinking that maybe we are neglecting the anger of Jesus from it, this chapter, I think, answers it. So let's go to page 108, and you're going to see what he says there. Look, he even raises the question here. How does this emphasis on Christ's heart, his gentle and lowly heart, his deep compassion, fit with the episodes of anger that we find in the Gospels? Are we being unhelpfully partial if we focus on his gentleness? Is he not also wrathful? So yes, that is a natural question. A natural question concerning, well, if we emphasize his compassion, aren't we neglecting the fact that he is wrathful, that he's angry? How does this fit together? So he's addressing what we and I would be struggling with, or some would be struggling with, and some struggling with, and even saying this isn't worth looking at. But he does point out what Warfield does. Warfield gives us something to chew on, so to speak, something for us to digest with regards to the issue of his anger and compassion. And we see that at the bottom of 108 going up into the beginning of 109. So let me read you what Warfield says. It's pretty good. Warfield is saying that a morally perfect human, such as Christ, would be a contradiction if he didn't get angry. All right, let's stop there. The fact of the matter is that Jesus would be a contradiction if he didn't get angry. So anger is a natural part of who he is. Okay, let's continue on. Perhaps we feel that to the degree that we emphasize Christ's compassion, we neglect his anger. And to the degree that we emphasize his anger, we neglect his compassion. That is a natural flow of thought for you and I today in this world. If I emphasize his anger, then I'm degrading his compassion. If I emphasize his compassion, then I'm degrading his anger. Listen to what Warfield says. But what we must see is that the two rise and fall together. The compassionless Christ would never have gotten angry at the injustices around him, the severity of human barbarity, even flowing from the religious elite. No, compassion and indignation rise together in his soul. All right, now you catch what he's saying. He's saying that the two fit together. You have to have one to have the other. You have to have compassion to have anger. And in fact, he's saying that if Jesus wasn't compassionate, there is no way that he could be angry. And if he wasn't angry at things, there's no way that he could be compassionate. The two are together. Now, he makes this point, the author makes this point, Ortlund makes this point, by then going through examples of Jesus' anger that we often point to. Well, what about him turning over the tables of the money changers? And what he does is he points out how the two, the compassion and the anger, fit together. So then he kind of gives us, the author gives us a summation of the point over on 110 that I think is very good for you and I to reflect on. What we are saying is that, yes, Jesus got angry and still gets angry. for he is the perfect human, who loves too much to remain indifferent. Whoa, that is an awesome point. Listen to that. He loves too much to remain indifferent. That is a powerful point. And this righteous anger reflects his heart, his tender compassion. But because his deepest heart is tender compassion, he is the quickest to get angry and feel anger most furiously, and all without a hint of sin tainting anger. Now, he goes on then and expresses how John chapter 11, the passage concerning the raising of Lazarus, gives us a perfect illustration of what we're talking about. So he focuses on verse 33 to 38. So again, I'm reading from the New King James. Listen to what John writes. Therefore, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her weeping, he groaned in the spirit and was troubled. Okay, now, he's talking about right there when Jesus sees Mary, Martha weeping, and when he sees the Jews around them weeping because of the death of Lazarus and they're mourning, he's groaning within himself, his spirit. He is troubled. Warfield points out here that he is indignant because of the reality of what has happened because of death. Now here's what he said. Verse 34, and he said, where have you laid him? And they said to him, Lord, come and see. Verse 35, powerful verse, 2 words. Jesus wept. That's his emotion. Verse 36, then the Jews said, see how he loved him. And some of them said, could not this man who opened the eyes of the blind also have kept this man from dying? Now look at verse 36. And again, then Jesus again, groaning in himself. So from his innermost being of emotion, anger, compassion, came to the tomb. It was a cave and a stone was laid against it. If you go into verse 39, he tells them to take away the stone. He then acts out of that emotion and what? Raises Lazarus from the dead. So he's showing us here that Jesus is perfect in having both emotions. And let's be honest, that for us is important right now because he understands and he feels for us. So this is where the author then goes as he concludes the chapter by giving us an application. And so let me just read this to you because I can't get any better than what he says here. Listen to what the author writes. Are you angry today? Let us not be too quick to assume that our anger is sinful. After all, the Bible positively orders us to be angry when the occasion calls for it. Perhaps you have reason to be angry. Perhaps you have been sinned against. The only appropriate response is anger. Be comforted by this. Jesus is angry alongside you. He joins you in your anger. Indeed, he is angrier than you could ever be about the wrong done to you. Your just anger is a shadow of his. His anger, unlike yours, has zero taint of sin in it. As you consider those who've wronged you, let Jesus be angry on your behalf. His anger can be trusted, for it is an anger that springs from his compassion for you. The indignation he felt when he came upon the mistreatment of others in the gospel is the same indignation he feels now in heaven upon the mistreatments of you. In that knowledge, release your debtor and breathe again. Let Christ's heart for you only wash you in the compassion, not only wash you in the compassion, but also assure you of his solidarity and rage against the distresses you are sent, that you, most centrally, death and hell. That is a powerful thought. That is how we can apply the reality of his emotions for you and I. And that's something for us to think about. about chapter 11.